Good morning, everyone. Come on, you can do better than that. Let's get some energy going in this room. I know a lot of you, I know it's early, but it's going to be a great day and a half. We're thrilled to have you. I'm Abe Madcore. I'm publisher and executive editor of SBJ and SBD. On behalf of our organization, on behalf of Esports Observer, thrilled to have you here with us. Got a great day and a half planned. I do want to thank our sponsors, Carmine and everyone at Lagardère Sports. Here's what our goals are. Our goals are to give you the most informative, intelligent discussion on the esports business space anywhere. And we got great panels. We're going to touch on everything from franchising to esports and pop culture to venues to valuations. We need your engagement, love your help, love your questions. So bring them. Panels, moderators will ask them. I also want to say that we are going to spend today in this room and tomorrow we're going to Riot for an on-site tour of the Riot Games, and the studio will be awesome. It'll be great. So goals are to have a great discussion and to have you all network and get to know each other. So my suggestion is meet people. A lot of great people in this room, a lot of people learning, a lot of people who have been in the business for a long time. So get to know each other, have a lot of fun. And finally, I want to thank Laura Case of our group who put this program together. So give her a round of applause. And if there's anything we can do over the next day and a half, any questions, any concerns, any comments, and any feedback, we want to hear it. So let us know. We have a lot of staff around over the next day and a half. So with that, let's kick it off, shall we? We're going to have a great discussion on a look at where we are in the state of esports. And my good friend Marc Riccio from Lagardère Sports is going to kick us off. Give it up for Marc Riccio.
Thank you very much.
All right, Father. Good luck.
Thank you very much. All right, so first and foremost, thank you very much to Abe, Chris, the whole team at Sports Business Journal and the Esports Observer for having us here. It was about 2 years ago we actually were in this very room and we talked about where the business was with great excitement and with a lot of questions and where it would go. And here we are a few years later and a lot of those questions have been answered with a lot more coming down the line, and that's pretty exciting. So with that said, we're going to dive right into it. So what I want to be able to outline for you today is kind of a look back at some of the things we talked about last year in terms of what to look for, how we're doing against those thoughts, but a look ahead, but also a focus on brand. So for those of you who don't know Lagardère, we're about 30 offices, about 1,600 people across the globe, and we've got a consulting group, we've got a live event production group, and we've got a sales group that talks to properties every day, and we talk to brands every day. So it's really through that brand lens with which I'm going to focus this conversation because brands fund so much of what we do in this business. So last year we really talked about improving structure, right? Whether that is tournament play, but also franchising, revenues, as well as the entrance of more non-endemic brands. So how we doing against that? So certainly Activision Blizzard has really led the charge in terms of a structured model with franchising. You see the introduction of the Call of Duty, 8 new franchises around Overwatch League. But it's not just about these games. You also saw the entrance of more franchises around, say, NBA 2K. They're adding 2 more. Take it a step further. It's not just about the U.S. and the franchising model. Europe has actually introduced this model, which is not a franchising market. As we know, they're a promotion relegation type market. But yet, you saw through Riot, League of Legends, and the European Masters, where they've introduced 13 new regional scenes. Out of that, you've seen great growth in viewership. A significant amount of new sponsors have actually come into the LEC system, of which we're happy to be a part of that. And then certainly, it's also been the groundwork for introducing talent into the system and cultivating that talent. So let's talk substantial and revenue. So as you see, I put substantial in quotations because it is quite relative. But if you look at the growth of esports, you certainly see doubling over the last 2017 into next year. Estimates are about 1.1 billion this year. So how does that compare? Now, in some levels, I don't like these comparisons because it's not fair. I mean, these leagues have been running for a long period of time, but at the same time, these comparisons come nonetheless. But as you can see, League One, which is the French league, we're going to eclipse that next year, and that's pretty exciting. So non-endemics. Just a snapshot here. There's obviously been a lot more, but certainly some of these have gotten a lot of headlines. And the reason why we highlight some of these is because they represent different regions and they represent different business categories. And I think that's really important when you're looking at how the business starts to expand, but you also start to look at how teams and organizations need brands to make their model sustainable. And then here's a nice snapshot. This is something we've kind of tracked through the years, that you look at how endemics, but also non-endemics, have now taken a greater share of participation in the industry. All right, let's shift to 2020 and 3 things to watch. Watch number 1, first and foremost, is the impact of influencers and casters, and why. And again, through that brand lens, it's really about adding credibility. You can speak to different audiences, and you become IP agnostic. You're not game specific, and you get both target and scale, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's take a look. Certainly you've got fantastic platforms with which these influencers can use. You see some of those, but then here's a snapshot of just a few, right? You've got Faker, for those of you who don't know, South Korean League of Legends player, probably the most famous League of Legends player there is. You also, certainly many of you will know Nate Shot and Shox, who you see on the right. What's interesting here is you see different regions. You see gamers who then turn themselves into business people. You see casters who actually now freelance in an effort to influence the marketplace and make themselves more marketable. And the reason why influencers are so relevant and important is brands are asking, how do I get beyond just the competition? How do I get beyond just the game? And what's also relevant is that, and by the way, we had a little problem with the font, so that's why you'll see some overlap here with some of the graphics and wording. But the reason why it's also so relevant is you look at the words influencers use. Brands love these words. And admittedly, they love them more than battle and kill type words. Now, I don't want to take that out of the equation. That is part of competition. But the reality, when you're using words like inclusive and create and empower, brands love that. And that's important to how they define the value proposition. So what to watch, number 2, the live event and fan experience. Certainly you get a lot of headlines when you're talking these major events like the Worlds at League of Legends in Paris, when you're talking Fortnite's big event and Overwatch League Grand Finals at Wells Fargo. But beyond that, on the micro level, it is a way for organizations to attach themselves to their communities in a meaningful way. And the live event fan experience is something that fans will now shift to expect, as opposed to it was just great to be part of the community. They're now going to start to expect that. And from a brand perspective, it is an important vehicle with which they can connect the brand to the consumer beyond just the digital space. So some interesting research here. So we were kind of digging into this, and there's been a lot of talk about saturation and so many events in the marketplace. How do you distinguish? But in reality, the market always wins. We talk about that all the time, and I think you're starting to see that market correction when you look at the number of events from a tournament standpoint in esports, peaked at about 5,200 in 2015, and it's actually started to decline a little bit. But conversely, you also see the prize money is actually escalating a great deal. So what does that mean? Well, combine it with the other big trend, and that is around venues and training facilities. I just put a few there in terms of Dallas Envy just announced theirs, North Texas, which is a university, Oklahoma has a new facility. Talking to some people here about breaking grounds on new facilities like Team Solomid and others. And this is only going to increase. And these are great opportunities for teams to diversify their revenue channels. Physical structures like training facilities and venues are manifestations of that team's organization and brand. And then conversely, consumer brands want to be a part of that. And it's a tremendous opportunity to touch, to feel, to drive business and revenue. It's making the event experience a bigger and bolder opportunity. Now, we all don't have big budgets to produce these phenomenally big events. That's not what we mean here. We mean that you're going to see a continued trend in utilizing those training facilities and tournaments to meaningfully engage, and that's what brands are asking us about. All right, what to watch number 3? Content development and distribution. I'm going to talk about this in the micro macro level as well. So it's not just about having and creating content. It's actually having a proper strategy behind it. And it's not about just putting numbers on a page. It's about how you engage. And you got to remember the consumer that we're working with here is the creator, collaborator, consumer. And actually, just like you're going to hear a little bit more about the live event experience with Overwatch and my colleague Mark Tarazi, you're going to hear a lot about the creator, collaborator, consumer at the end of the day with a research panel with Dom Curran and our colleagues at Cassandra. And those are going to be very interesting how these things play out. But in addition to that content strategy is also what can stick and ball sport teach us? And I'm going to dig into that for a minute. So let's take a look at Players Tribune. Now, I'm not picking on the Players Tribune, but there was an interesting article in Digiday a couple weeks ago that really talked about, I would say, the failure to not have the proper strategy in just building content as opposed to not fully thinking through how to price it, how to pivot when the market tells you something otherwise, the frequency, the types of content, what type of social voice you want to have. And they're now facing some struggles in terms of retaining users and getting additional content. And the other one I'm going to draw an alignment to is European football. We work with a lot of European football clubs. And what you see with European football clubs, they talk a lot about their growth and the number of users they have on Twitter and the number of users they have on Instagram, but their engagement numbers are below 1%. So what does that tell you? It tells you either they're bots, not real fake accounts, or they're not engaging properly. So you've really got to focus. It's not just because you've got a training facility now and you've got your studio and you've got the opportunity to actually create content. What brands want to understand is how are you using that content to solve my business problem? And they're really pressuring us on making that connection. And for everybody in the room who lives in this space, it's a great opportunity. But it's not just about growth. It's about how you engage and making sure that your engagement plans are working and consistent. And then likewise, what are you doing to create? What are you doing to allow your fan base to create? And what's so interesting here is that our fan base is not just consuming the internet. They're not reading it. They're writing it. They're creating it. And so what are we doing as an industry to help brands connect to consumers to create? And that's really important in this space. So stick and ball. So I found this very interesting because what I did is I went back and looked at certainly the growth of rights for, say, NFL and NBA. And I get it, right? NFL, NBA, they're the larger properties in terms of opportunities when it comes to rights numbers. But what was interesting here is each of them entered a third party into the system. They entered themselves with their own direct-to-consumer product. And what that did is that created a healthy competitive tension with regards to how they negotiated their rights and content deals. And all of you are in the same position to do so. So it's very curious to see what we watch over the course of the next year is how the titles use their own direct-to-consumer opportunities to balance that competitive nature, say, with the Twitch and Mixers of the world. Likewise, how each of you can do the same. And brands want to ride that train. They want to be part of that. They're asking for it. But what's also really important, it's not just about the number. It's really, if you look at what NBC did for the Premier League when they came into the US, yes, the number was healthy. Yes, CBS just re-upped for quite a healthy number with Champions League. But what was interesting about Premier League is they really capitalized on the promotional value that partner offered them. And again, from a brand perspective, it's a great opportunity to bring that brand along for the ride, and from a monetization standpoint and from a growth standpoint. And I do believe strongly that the two should coexist, but we'll be curious to see how that plays out over the next year. All right, last one, data and insights. The reality is we're still educating. We're still de-risking brand decisions. We get it very often. I'm going to walk you through an example very shortly about how that comes to be. But these last 2 points here are super important as it relates to identifying the business problem. Every deal that gets done because it solves a business problem for the brand. So how are we connecting that business problem to your asset and an esport asset that can actually solve that problem? That's what we get challenged with every day. And in that process, data and insights is our only way to really meaningfully do that other than anecdotal or what we think. And so brands are pressuring us a great deal on the use of data and insights to validate their decision making. And so one of the most important things I want to stress is that we are still educating between esports and gaming when it comes to brand conversations. As crazy as that might sound, but we still are. But if you look at expanding the opportunity beyond just the competitive gaming part of it, and by the way, I do not want to minimize that, but I do want to recognize that brands are looking for scale. and they are looking for attracting a larger consumer base, and really focusing on the gaming community as opposed to just the esport in and of itself is certainly a way to do that. And we've seen that happen, and we've seen that desire from brands. The other important fact is that we often find ourselves in the trap, and I have done it myself, in terms of comparing us to other sports. That's good, that's fine, that's not a problem. But the reality is brands are actually comparing us to other passion points and lifestyle sectors. They're comparing us to music. They're comparing us to fashion, food, culture, the arts. And where does esports and gaming fit as a brand? Where does that fit in my decision-making process? And so we're seeing more and more of that as we go in to talk to brands and talk to agencies. You're educating them, but then you're also in this mode right here where you're comparing them to other opportunities. So, got one more slide that I'm going to walk you through. So this is a real-world story. And it's kind of a look of also the interplay between global, regional, and local. And we're all, in this industry on many levels global properties, but decisions are often made on a regional or local level. So we were talking to and pitching a consumer product brand. All right. And that brand, really, the conversation had started with our colleagues in Germany, and it quickly shifted to a pan-European opportunity. So the UK folks were brought in. And then they said, well, US has got the bigger budgets. It's a bigger market. Let's loop the US in. So it became a multi-regional, if you will, opportunity. And what they were looking at is say, all right, here's our consumer profile, right? We got male, female. We're probably a little more male in Europe in terms of a focus. We're a little more female in the US. How can esports solve our problem? How can you drive to retail? How can you drive more transactions? All the KPIs that they had set, it was a very meticulous process. It wasn't just about, we think we want to be in here, so let's check the box and see what happens. This was really a thought-out process. So how do we do that? So first thing is, we find ourselves matched up against music festival. Particularly in the US, they had a music strategy. It was not a sports strategy that they were comparing us to. It was a music festival strategy. They said to us, how can you attract our customer base better than we're currently doing through music? And the only way to really do that is insights. And actually, we put together quite a compelling value proposition around the size of the audience, the propensity of that audience to care about health and wellness and beauty products, et cetera. But we still didn't have enough. And that's one thing I'll challenge this industry is the research. We still need farther to go on research, and I get we're new and growing, but brands really want to see this. And if we had probably a little more research, the outcomes might have been a little different, and I'll kind of walk you through what the outcomes were. So anybody want to take a guess? Did this deal get done? Yes, no, maybe so? All right, well, I'm going to walk you through what happened. And I'll tell you why, which is also interesting because it also speaks to the different buying patterns and sell patterns that brands go through in Europe, say, versus the US under this scenario. Is that in Europe, there was a deeper understanding of the product. There was the deeper understanding of the product in terms of how it could help their brand and solve their business problems. In the US, they were a little bit of a laggard. Is they needed more information, they needed more data, and they still weren't fully convinced on the opportunity. What's also interesting here is that the US was about 3 or 4 more times expensive than the other parts of the world. And what's also interesting here is that these solutions were not just one asset or property. They included influencers, they included teams and organizations, they included leagues, both at the top tier as well as the masters or challenger level. So everything I talked about here was the solution that the brand wanted. And in 2 parts of the region of the world, they bought into it. In the US, they didn't. We're hopeful that that'll change moving down the road. But I think this is a snapshot in terms of what the trends are and what certainly we look to see happen moving forward into 2020 and beyond. So with that, I'd like to conclude, say thank you to everyone for being here. Looking forward to a great day. And if anybody has any questions, certainly hit me up now or afterwards.
So if you have questions, raise your hand. I've got a question. So you talked about the risks, information, research. What's the other reason brands could be saying no, Mark?
Well, I think there's still an education factor that goes on. And I think with certain types of games and titles, there's certainly some reputational risk or brand risk for shooter game that the brands are going to have. I mean, that's just a reality of the space that we're working with. But part of it is, and I use the US example here as an example, is they had an ongoing strategy that worked for them. And in this space, what we're often doing is we're trying to convince somebody to change their mind. And people need time to change their mind. And they need to see more proof, not only in terms of the research, but they need to also de-risk it above them. And that just takes time, and that takes education. So those are some of the factors that go into why brands may not jump on just yet.
If you had one message to publishers, it would be what?
Oh boy, that's a good one. Engage. Meaning that we're seeing tremendous growth. Do not take it for granted. Do not take it for granted. Engage and empower your teams to engage.
Questions for Marc? Anyone here? Great, thank you. Thanks.
Hey, a question for you on your example. You mentioned that the U.S. is a more expensive package than the Europe kind of markets. Who's driving the pricing in the U.S. versus Europe or even Asia? Because I know I work in the influencer space in general, and we see the same thing. Outside of the U.S., influencers are a lot cheaper, but internally, or domestically, I should say, sometimes 2-3 times that what it is.
It's mainly something that I deal with and we deal with a lot because we're a global agency. I think there's a couple things, and some of it is obvious and some of it is actually underlying. So from an underlying standpoint is really the cost of doing business in the U.S. is a little more expensive than it is in other markets. There are social, geopolitical structures in other markets that keep costs low. They keep wages down low because you don't have to pay for college, as an example, in Europe, or pay less for college. Those types of social policies actually affect pricing, as an example. Your cost of health in Europe is less than we pay for healthcare here in the States. As a result, you got to pay people more here. So it's some of those issues that actually affect pricing and cost of doing business. And then the other obvious one is the fact that the U.S. is a bigger market. I mean, you're talking just the scale is bigger. So people think that they can charge more simply by the fact that one.
Pro rata would be similar, you think? Because I mean, the market factors are the same whether we're talking about esports or the NBA or cereal. Right?
And Marc, just repeat what she asked again.
So the question was really around pro rata, meaning if I got that right, meaning in other sectors, right? And interestingly enough, yeah. So the cost to run an activation in the U.S. is much more than it is the cost to run an activation in France or the U.K. Even if the audience level is exactly the same. Meaning you're going to put 100,000 people in a fan experience that's going to run for 2 days around a major event. The cost of doing that in the U.S. is absolutely more than it is in Europe.
But it sounds like that's not problematic just for esports. That would be for everybody.
That's for everybody. That relates to motorsports, soccer, if you will. And we see regularly because we activate in both those spaces. And so I'll have colleagues from Europe call and say, hey, we want to do X, Y, Z, run a Formula E race in New York. And we're like, all right, it's going to cost X amount. And they're like, whoa, sticker shock, right? I do that in France and it's much less. I'm like, we're not in France anymore. And I don't mean to be rude, but the cost of doing business is more. And a lot of it has to do with those cost basis in the U.S. is generally higher than it is in other markets.
Esports isn't saying hey, we're growing 2x in the U.S. versus Europe, therefore our price is 2x. We're saying this is just flat.
In part, yes, it is just the nature of doing business in different parts of the world, but also in part the U.S. is the biggest, I shouldn't say the biggest, the U.S. has some tremendous and big opportunities as it relates to esports. There's a reason why, just like European football and esport gets launched in certain parts of the world, and you expand east and west to expand your opportunities, and certainly we're the west side of that equation.
Well, Marc's going to, any other questions for Marc? One here.
Real quick, thank you for the presentation. Shankar from Mortensen. How do you kind of reconcile the teams versus leagues? How they get the revenue stream up and running? Because in the traditional sports, the league does a little bit on asset appreciation, but in terms of cash flow generation, the teams seem to have a good view of how to generate that. How do you kind of do that with this new structure of franchises coming in and few teams coming in? What is the role of the teams versus the publishers who are reading the leagues?
And Marc, just repeat that, please.
So the question really is around how do you reconcile, or what do you recommend, if I could say this the right way, in terms of teams' ability to generate revenue versus the titles, if you will, which in essence are the leagues. So I got a lot of background with that, working in the NFL for a long period of time. There is a, I will call it a healthy tension most of the time between a league and a team. That they absolutely need each other, but they compete many times for the same dollar. And so that is probably never going to go away. And on some level, it keeps everybody honest. And as long as there's proper balance with that and that tension is healthy, I think that raises the value proposition and the enterprise value as a whole. With that said, from a team perspective, and this is when I said earlier, when Abe's question about what do I recommend for leagues, is the teams are investing a significant amount of money. It costs a lot of money to operate a team, and the teams can answer that better than I can. You need to empower them to engage and then therefore generate revenue. If they are not given the tools to generate revenue, the system will collapse. So from a team perspective, teams need to be creative, they need to be professionalized, which they are, and they need to, and we're seeing this more and more, is find new revenue channels that are sustainable. That's their own direct-to-consumer products, that is there are these venues, that is sponsorship for sure, and possibly their own types of content and media deals on the side. So there is a balance there. I don't think we've found that yet, to be honest with you. And again, you're going to hear from teams today. I'm sure the teams are going to answer that much better than I can.
Mark, you got one here?
Hey, good morning, Mark. I just had a question about the community that you were speaking about earlier and how brands like to hear things like community and activation and empower. Are you seeing the dollars flow more from like sponsoring teams and like players and more towards like events and activations and things like that? Or what do you expect in the market?
Well, from what we see, it's less about the events. Because the events are these big moments in time, and from a brand perspective, and this is irregardless of esport and other stick and ball sports, to invest a lot of money in one event is hard because you can't necessarily get to scale. Where we see most of the money flowing right now clearly is the leagues. I mean, LPL has done a great job in terms of revenue generation in Asia. LEC, which we're fortunate enough to work with, I think had the highest number of new partners enter their system from a brand perspective. And those are great signs. Overwatch League, I know, did a great job in terms of bringing new and non-endemics, into their system this year. So you definitely see that trend from a league standpoint. Where I think you're going to see more and more teams start to generate revenue is as they professionalize and as they understand their assets better. I think you have some that do that quite well, and I think you have some that are still learning. So right now, to me, most of the revenue really is flowing to the league and the titles, but teams... candidly, teams are going to need to generate revenue to sustain themselves. And I think you're going to see more of that come into the system as they get better and better at monetizing their assets.
Marc Riccio, thank you very much. Enjoyed it. He's going to be around.